we also do some funding for NDC support stuff around superpollutants, and so kind of wanting to see a little bit how that works, panning out, and just get this feel how much we need to continue supporting NDC versus implementation. It seems like a turning point, so
it should be. Good.
Yeah. So that's primarily it. And I've never been to one of these, and I've been working in this area for a long time, so might as well do the one that's in Africa.
Yeah. Did RP talk to you about initial thinking around short-lived climate?
He mentioned that he was doing that and that we should catch up later. We just chatted as I was on my way out to come back here. So
more akin for a future conversation.
Yeah. But excited to chat about it because we just had our super pollutant summit. And kind of that's usually the opportunity to sort of see the landscape, what's missing, where the gaps, where there are opportunities. There's certainly a lot of areas that could benefit from more philanthropic engagement.
Yeah, that's our initial sense.
And I think it's been good also to see some of the hub events and just kind of see how that's evolving. Wish there was more Q&As and all these things. Like everything that I've gone to, there's not been any Q&A, which has been surprising to me.
That is kind of weird.
I think this one is.
I gather this one is meant to have a lot. So I told Patty this, like on the EJ stuff, we can't talk about like donors or color pledge or anything like that because it's in consideration internally, and so if anything like that, we are part of it. Comes up,
I can take that.
Let you take it because that was my one caution.
I can talk about us having joined the pledge. It'd be good to chat if you think we can give you some of the experience.
Really not support that?
Good overall. I think it could be more. There could be more done from the donor scholar side of things. If you decide to do it, I think it will be re-energizing of that effort.
It's above my pay grade.
Huh?
I just think it's above my pay grade.
Yes.
But it's not. I mean, it's obviously like not a principled opposition to anything.
No.
But a challenge of like, how do we think about our international?
But you don't need to.
But if you look at the overall percentage of our funding, like
that's where it is.
We are one of, if not the biggest global South funder in climate. So how do we think about that in the context of like a very domestic
lens into
who
is marginalized or what segments of them? Well, it's a conversation that we definitely, because we have a global program and we have these commitments, so we've started to think about how we want to engage. And grantees have started thinking about what equity means to them in their national context and all of that stuff. So that's been interesting as well.
And that's the conversation we feel on founding team. The equitable element of it globally is high, Okay, I'm trying to figure out if I can get our press release.
Unfortunately, there was no.
How come you're writing a press release?
That's a very good question. Not that one, but our one from the...
Not again.
Our announcement press release, just so I have the right philanthropies on my mind, because no, but that's a good question. Why am I writing the other press release? Because some partners just
are not quite
never. Anyway.
Sorry to interrupt. I just want to let you two are going to share this microphone.
Okay.
You're going to get it first.
Okay.
So go back and forth as
Yeah.
needed.
Us two.
Yeah.
Got it. Got it. Okay.
And also won't get caught up if you're gesticulating wildly.
Which I do from time to time. We just talked about that scene from The West Wing, and she said just Josh Lyman is out there gesticulating wildly.
Is Josh Wyman here? Wyman, great. He's a climate guy in his real life.
Is he really?
So,
Okay.
or at least I know he's a progressive political person.
That's good to hear.
Which tend to go together these days.
Yeah.
All right, 1 minute warning. Everyone get their water. Get a comfortable seat.
Recording in progress.
In case there's any question, you are all being recorded. Welcome. Good afternoon. We are all excited to welcome you to our session on accelerating climate philanthropy. I want to thank you all for joining us today here at the COP, and to thank the IPCC for being so kind as to host us in their pavilion. Today we're going to do a deep dive into the topic of climate philanthropy and try to understand some of the challenges that are facing climate philanthropists, and also try to understand some of the best practices in the field. We're going to look closely at questions about how to incorporate frontline communities into the philanthropic process and understand how philanthropic collaborations are forming to try to address this crisis that we're facing. we hope to have a very dynamic conversation both amongst us, but also we will have time for some Q&A, so get your questions ready. I'll give you a warning when we're going to start going to the audience. And so for this conversation, we put together an extraordinary panel that includes these four distinguished women to my left. Patty Ree, who is a Chief Partnerships Officer at the Global Methane Hub. We next have Fanta Kamakate, who is the Senior Program Officer for Climate and Energy at the Pisces Foundation. Colette Pinchon-Battle, who is a Vision and Initiatives Partner for Taproot Earth. And then finally, Hannah McKinnon, who is a Program Director at the Sequoia Climate Foundation. And I am your moderator today. My name is Randall Kempner. I'm a Senior Advisor to the Aspen Institute's Energy and Environment Program. And in this capacity, I focus on issues related to climate-smart money, including issues related to climate philanthropy. So I'm going to kick us off and give you some facts and figures about climate philanthropy, which hopefully will be of interest and should seed our discussion. And I have divided them up into the good news and the bad news. So we're going to start with the good news because that's always a little bit more fun. And the good news, other than the flies that are around, is that climate philanthropy is increasing. It is going up, and it's actually going up quite fast. According to a recent Climate Works report, climate mitigation philanthropy alone from foundations and individuals totaled somewhere between $7.5 and $12.5 billion in the world. And importantly, that number has been rising quickly. It was a 40% increase in foundation giving from last year to this year, and it's been a 3x increase from 2015 when it was only $900 million of foundation giving. So it's going up, and it's going up fast. Furthermore, we're seeing many major players with last names that we all know, we call them the Billionaires Brigade, getting really excited about climate change. So you've got Musk and Bezos and Powell Jobs and Gates and Resnick and Bloomberg and probably many more that I don't know that have all made $500 million plus commitments to fighting climate. And it is not just individual billionaires that are coming in. We are seeing individual donors increasing. And importantly, we're seeing foundations coming together to collaborate on big initiatives. So in 2020, there were 39 foundations that came together to create the Global Climate Action Summit, or at the Global Climate Action Summit, to dedicate $6 billion to climate solutions by 2025. IKEA and Rockefeller Foundations launched a $1 billion platform last year to address climate change and energy poverty. And Rockefeller, as many of you know, basically said they're going to frame all of their giving through a climate lens starting next year. Also want to mention, because we'll come back to her, in 2021, the Global Methane Hub was launched by 15 foundations with $330 million, all pooled funding to support methane abatement. And that was done explicitly to support the Global Methane Pledge that was made by 110 countries at COP27 at last year's version of this event. But, and there's always a but, the amount of climate philanthropy that we see today is still tiny relative to the need at hand. Using that Climate Works analysis, global climate mitigation funding is still less than 2% of all total global philanthropy, and it has never been higher than 2%. If you look at the United States, where I live, it's the same story, or maybe even a little bit worse. According to McKinsey & Company estimates, in 2020, direct climate change giving was only 0.5%, less than 1% of total philanthropic giving. So that's a challenge, but it's not just the quantity of the philanthropic funding which is of concern, it's the quality of that funding. So a recent Center for Effective Philanthropy survey of foundation executives show that they themselves are not enthusiastic about the impact of their own climate programs. So this isn't me saying this. These are foundation executives who were surveyed, and only 11% of them said that they thought their own foundation's climate strategy was very effective. and only 4% of them felt like the broader philanthropic effort to address climate change was very effective. So that's giving themselves, to be really clear, a 5 on a 5-point scale. There were plenty of 4s, but philanthropists are generally a little bit more excited about what they're doing. Now, part of this issue is that clearly climate change is a really big, honkin', challenging systemic issue. Philanthropy alone will not solve climate change. No sector can solve it alone. So this is a hard one. But still, many foundations are simply not comfortable that they have found the best approaches yet. And in particular, they were least confident about their ability to deliver solid climate equity strategies, and they noted a need for a focus on more frontline communities. And then finally, before I get to the panel, they did say that they did 2 things reasonably well. That when foundation funding worked well, it's because it had a policy focus, and or it's because they collaborated with other foundations. So, I want to learn a little bit more with you all about this world from people who do it. And for the folks who are actively engaged in making, influencing, and receiving grants are all represented on this stage. So Patty, I'd like to start with you. And if you can you please explain the genesis of the Global Methane Hub? What is it? Why is it important? And in particular, how were you able to get so many different foundations to sign on and put their money all in one basket?
Thank you, Randall, for organizing all of us to talk about this important topic. It's great to see many of you here because I think really, again, part of this is a conversation with you. What are we doing well? What are we not? Global Methane Hub was started at last COP as a result of the Global Methane Pledge and the need there to be a catalyzer attached to what the governments were trying to do. And as you know, that is one of the areas, as little amount as it is being spent by the philanthropies, the thing that it does do well is serve as a booster. Literally, the terminology we use in the United States to say when you bring about momentum to something that is sedentary. And I think fundraising really plays that role well. What do we need to get off the ground or speed up in order for us to truly create momentum? So a couple of well-known philanthropies, including Sequoia, Pisces, and Hewlett, and led by Marissa de Beauvoir from High Tide, really got the group together to say, what can we do to bring about quick action and create a community that focuses on methane? So it was really those folks who came together and called their friends, their billionaires calling their billionaire friends, in order to bring, it was actually 22 entities that had pledged $210 million at the beginning, and another entity that pledged $100 million aligned funding. So together it was about $110 million. Since then, we've been able to work with governments, subnationals like state of California, which has alone committed $100 million for their methane action program. We have worked with other philanthropies who have specific focus, which we will get to by the panel, to really bring in the conversation about environmental justice into methane mitigation, who have come on board. So now we're at about 25 foundations having pulled their money together to really focus on methane and how do we, as an ecosystem, work to move fast on this. I was at New York Climate Week where the Minister of Environment from Maldives, I think, put it really eloquently at a Google climate dinner, where she said, you know, we only have 86 months from point of no return. And it's really for the developed countries and high-income countries, it's going to be a nuisance. It's going to be a change in lifestyle. But for those of us in Maldives, it is a point of no return from a lifestyle we love and dearly want to hold on to. That's the role I think philanthropy really has an opportunity to play, bring about awareness of where the holes and gaps are. We are a very small piece of the pie for a larger, broader climate movement, but we zeroed in on methane because methane is 80 times more powerful than carbon, but it is also short-lived, so we can make a change. You know, I akin it to, it's the thing you can triage in the emergency room before you get to the real surgery. And that is we're trying to stop the bleeding so we can fix the full health of Earth. And that's where I think the Global Methane Pledge and Global Methane Hub was brought in to do, buy us time so we can fix the bigger problem that is before us. And without methane mitigation, it is going to be impossible for us to actually see a bending of the warming curve. So our role here is to make all of you in this space successful in the work you're doing. Our three main sort of core role that we see is, one, we are a catalyzer for the field that is out there doing the actual work. We are conveners, so as many times as possible, you know, organizations, countries, groups are talking to each other, and we really are the group that sees ourselves as just really at the end completing the thing. If there is thing that is not being met, you know, we come in to be the resource at the beginning and then at the tail end. That is really our mission, and in different sectors, as you know, you are all aware of, in agriculture, oil and gas, the energy space, and also waste and circular economy. So that's where we see our space, but really, again, the real work is being done by those who are thinking about methane with a lens of, you know, justice, or thinking about global south, thinking about, you know, what role can we really play in the broader picture of the climate change.
Great. Thanks, Pei. Really great overview. Fanta, interested to know at Pisces how you are taking a systemic approach to all of this. As I mentioned in the beginning, this is a big honking systemic problem. It seems like you agree with that and are trying to address it in that way. So can you share a bit more about that?
Sure. It might be helpful for me to explain a little bit Pisces' priorities. For a climate and energy program, the Pisces Foundation, which is about a 10-year-old institution, is entirely focused on short-lived climate pollutants or super pollutants. This was made a priority because when we started the foundation, we really wanted to have a focus on underfunded, underappreciated areas that where if there was additional philanthropic investment, they would yield the critical solutions that we need to address the climate crisis at scale and at the speed we need to address it at. And so short-lived climate pollutants or super pollutants include action on those pollutants includes curbing methane from oil and gas, waste, also from agriculture. It also means eliminating diesel, black carbon from transportation. It means phasing down HFCs from cooling appliances. And taken together, measures on super pollutants, they're the only way that we are going to make our goals of capping temperature change at 1.5 degrees. You cannot do it without doing that. And so being able to dedicate resources to that area is a priority for the foundation. Now, in doing so, we've learned a lot over the 10 years, right? So we started with an approach really focused on policy, an area that you indicated in your notes has been very successful for philanthropy. And we realized as we learned supporting policy work is that you need an ecosystem of thriving organizations taking different approaches with a shared goal, but not necessarily in lockstep, to be able to achieve the kind of transformative actions that we need to address the climate crisis and its root causes, because we're not just talking about emissions, we're talking about the whole system that generates emissions. So when we're addressing a systemic problem, taking a view of the ecosystem, the landscape of organizations that can act is really important, and developing approaches that fund groups, coalitions, campaigns, networks in the way that supports them in doing their work is really important. And so in our portfolio, we have 3 areas of interventions that I think would be helpful to highlight. One is policy advocacy, because we're dealing with an issue that is impacting communities right now, and so they need relief right now. And superpollutant is an area where the mitigation technologies and strategies are feasible. Most of them are cost effective. They can be implemented with a lot of community and political buy-in. And so, let's get those policies done. But while we're doing that, near-term work in the system that we exist in, we also have to look at why emissions are increasing and what's driving pollution, and support the movements and the organizations that are building movements and demands for action on climate at speed and at scale that center the communities that are most impacted. So complementing that direct policy action with supporting movement building that can lead to longer-term systems change. And then our third area is thinking about the infrastructure that supports those movements. The summits, the convenings, the shared tools, the places where people can strategize and agree on joint priorities, and also can negotiate their disagreements and decide where they think their action is most useful. All of those things are things that require actual resources to make sure they happen. They don't just happen in a vacuum. And so as a foundation, we're really committed to supporting infrastructure to support movements and organizations, catalyze collective action.
Great, thank you. Colette, what's the backstory of Taproot? Tell us a little bit about your goals, and in particular, please sort of share the evolution of being an organization that was based in just the Gulf Coast of the United States to one which now is working and has global aspirations.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's an honor to be here today. I just want to say peace to the original people of this land, bringing peace from the Choctaw Territory in Louisiana in the United States. This is a really great moment for us as Taproot Earth, but we did not begin as Taproot Earth. We began in 2005 in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. I live just outside of the city of New Orleans, which most people know, and it was really that work that propelled us into disaster recovery. At that time, it was just disaster recovery. 5 years after Katrina, we had the BP oil drilling disaster, and this is when we began to connect some dots around what was really happening to us and our region. And so what started off as a disaster response organization, really just rooted in our community, turned into an organization that was working regionally that needed to have a bigger understanding of what was happening to us. And what we learned, and these were very hard, difficult lessons to learn, but what we learned is that even in those moments of resources, a lot of resources coming in, a lot of communication being at our use, even people coming down to add capacity to the work, the truth is that the ground was not being changed. First of all, we had big groups of displaced people in many different places, so leaving from New Orleans and Louisiana, going to Texas and Georgia and Tennessee, but really understanding that the change that we needed to see was rooted in both self-determination as well as a democratization of information. So what you really got to understand in the aftermath of both Hurricane Katrina and the BP oil drilling disaster was just where the information on recovery, justice, where those things were held. And it was not the South. And so what we began to understand is that we needed to really balance out this imbalance that did not allow our communities to recover. And so this is when we really began the process of understanding our role in a global conversation around the climate crisis. And we began to understand that our solidarity needed to be not just with the Gulf, which was a region that we had to define for ourselves because people were calling it the Gulf Coast. We developed through a community process the term Gulf South. We have then began to connect with Appalachia and these other regional connections. But we also understood that we were of the U.S. South and were more in line to what was happening in the global South, which means we needed to develop a global understanding of what was happening to many communities, including the communities that Patty spoke about. And so this global South solidarity is actually why we're here at COP27. We are here to advocate for global climate reparations, and we stand with that demand, mostly because we understand what it is to actually have to recover from this impact, and we understand that firsthand. This is not a theory for us. We have lived through climate disaster. We know what this is going to look like, and we know what this is going to look like for the most marginalized and targeted communities. Even in the global north, it looks a lot like what's happening in the global south. And so I just want to mention, because many of you are in philanthropy, with a loving, firm heart, that the movement actually, we really need philanthropy in line with us. And this is a real opportunity. The moment of no return is real. It's real for us too. At Taproot Earth, we're only going to exist for 7 years. This is a new approach. Most people are thinking like, what do you mean you're just going to have an organization for 7 years? Well, by 2030, you should all be rethinking your organizations, because this is a point where nothing that we think right now is going to be the same. And this is how we're going to exist in the world. In 2005, the same year as Hurricane Katrina, the UN actually approved the definition of of reparations, not climate reparations, of reparations. And there are three key things I want to just say to you as philanthropists who want to be in line with movement. One, we need a cessation of harm. This means we need philanthropy really thinking about how you're funding organizations that are fighting false solutions. Methane it's a wonderful place to start, because in the Gulf South and in oil areas like the Gulf South, we're seeing not just methane proliferation, we're seeing big billions of dollars from our federal government going into clean solutions that require methane as a feedstock. This is what we cannot allow philanthropy to continue to fund, because they don't have the knowledge around these false solutions. There are groups fighting this, and we need philanthropy to fund the groups that are fighting these false solutions. We really need to redistribute these resources. I'm sorry to say, but a starting point in movement is understanding that the resources that a lot of philanthropy has access to is stolen. It's taken. It's ill-gotten gains. I think one opportunity that philanthropy has is to actually redistribute as a method of justice, as an opportunity to really rebalance what we've seen. But we don't just need a redistribution of dollars. That's not what we're talking about. We need a redistribution that actually accelerates self-governance. What are you funding that is rooted in people's own democratic process? This means we need you to give grants that don't require deliverables, don't require reporting. We need you to give resources to groups that can only tell you one thing. We might not know where the money's going to go, but we can tell you it will be through a collective decision-making process. Because what you are funding as philanthropy in that moment is not just a group. You're funding the growth of democratic process. And in this moment in time, both in the United States and in the globe, you should be funding more democracy. And democracy starts with the ground being able to practice making decisions for itself. One final point that I'll make is just around a last piece of reparations, which says you have to ensure the harm doesn't happen again. That's an element of reparations. Can you commit to funding, not just stopping a thing, but funding land back so that people can actually become more resilient? Communities can actually get to a point where they can fight the systems from happening again. Can you commit to funding the rebalancing of power? There's a system that allows wealth to accumulate to a very few and get down and create the systems that we have today. This is a difficult political stance. This requires a lot of conversation between the ground and philanthropy. But this is the request of philanthropy to actually move in partnership. The transition of Taproot has really been to understand that our learnings from Katrina and BP and who we are as part of a global South reality requires us to take a global approach. We are now building a global Black climate leaders network that spans the Black diaspora, rooted in where the transatlantic slave trade left its position. And we start from there to get solutions and replicate those solutions. And we think this is where the power is going to have to come from. It is the only thing that can combat the kind of monolithic system that we're dealing with now, is replication from the ground up.
Whew. No pressure, Hannah. But Sequoia Foundation has actually been around since 1983. Not Sequoia Climate, but Sequoia Foundation, right? No, that's a lot. I'm just making it up.
Oh, you're making it up. It's okay.
All right, it's been around for a while.
2 years.
Huh. For 2 years. But even though, in that case, so it's still been focused on environmental and climate issues that entire time, I'd love to know kind of what the focus areas are. And I know that you've had a couple of important things happening in the last few weeks. So maybe you can share that, and maybe also be the first to respond to some of the things that you've heard from your fellow panelists about the needs for philanthropy to act in different ways if we are going to succeed in having a just climate transition.
Thanks, Randall, and nice to see everyone, and that indeed very tough acts to follow. So I'll probably be brief so we can move into discussion from here. But yes, a little bit, very briefly on Sequoia. We are quite new. We launched almost 2 years ago. We'll have our 2-year birthday in February. And we are a mitigation-focused philanthropy. We have a 2030 deadline for the reasons that have been outlined here. And what we look at is, how do we do the heavy lifting in the next couple of years? It really matters how and when we get those emissions declines for overall. Am I too close?
I think it's you.
Thanks, Fanta. So sorry, we have a 2030 sort of time horizon as well. We're not mandated to end then, although similarly, I hope that we're having a very different conversation by that point in time. But we look across, we're an international funder, so we fund across major emitters. We have programs in China, India, the US, Europe, and then we do cross-cutting philanthropy in oil and gas, climate finance, and communications and movements. And at the heart of our thinking really is a systems-based approach. That's been named by everyone on the panel in one way or another. This is a challenge of enormous complexity, and I think a recognition that it is going to take a wide range of stakeholders working in close collaboration to have a chance at getting where we need to get to solve the climate crisis. And so that's at the heart of some of our thinking. Some other principles that we hold really closely are around, what does it mean to operate in a complex system? And this touches on how we fund and how we engage grantees. We look for, real world outcomes. And that's what is the change you want to see in the real world. And then how do we give grantees, how do we empower grantees to use their expertise to choose, the most appropriate, strategic, impactful, community-oriented path to a shared outcome, a shared high ambition outcome. And it really resonates with us, and it's something that I think we are really taking a hard look in the mirror at as philanthropy. What does it mean to support, meaningful place-based solutions? Randall alluded to it. We, along with a number of peers in the philanthropic space, made an announcement on Friday, a commitment of 500 million new and additional dollars to support low and middle income countries transition away from fossil fuels and towards clean energy in a way that is meaningfully just and equitable. And that starts with supporting groups and initiatives on the ground in the places where you need to, if you want solutions to stick, if you want them to be resilient, they have to come from the people who they will impact the most. And so that's really, really a fundamental principle of thinking through, that new giving. And, the other thing a couple of other things I'll say about that announcement is another reason that philanthropy pulled together to make it is a recognition that promises for finance have fallen short across the world since the beginning of this conversation. And there is a massive credibility gap and a deterioration in trust that's really detrimental to our collective progress on climate because wealthy northern countries haven't delivered on their promises for financial support for the developing world on climate. So we recognize, coming back to the value add of philanthropy, we can never come anywhere close to the scale that's required for that broader transition, but what are the opportunities for philanthropy to catalyze and support and bring additional funding in to hopefully drive strategically a step change in some of the broader financing mechanisms that are going to need to start to work really quickly. And then, the last thing I'll say about this announcement is, really one of the things I find most inspiring, and I will also say that, so I'm also new to philanthropy. I joined when Sequoia launched, and my entire career prior to that was in advocacy. And philanthropy is an enormously privileged seat to be in. We don't do the hard work. The field does the hard work, and having the humility of, who is in it day to day and what that means and what it means to support them meaningfully as philanthropy is certainly very important to me. And when I look across the global climate landscape, a lot of the most bold and ambitious climate leadership policies we see come from the global south, low, middle-income countries who, in spite of dealing with just extraordinary impacts of climate change at home, are still stepping up, and in the absence of the delivery of a lot of the promises that the global north have made. So there's that element, and then in parallel, as philanthropies, the other important caveat to that announcement is we have to tighten the screws on northern countries to step up ambition. This isn't it can't be a distraction from the need for wealthy developed countries to really scale their mitigation efforts in a way that reflects the urgency of the challenge that we're facing.
Awesome. So you all can see why we picked these panelists. Each of them has laid out a vision of and some really amazing actions that are being taken to try to drive more philanthropy and greater climate justice. I want to try to land us, though, in some of the hard questions and some of the actual tactics and the logistics and the hard stuff. So warning you now. Patty, I'm starting with you. Most of us don't get to be in the room where it happens. I want to know what it was like in the room and the rooms where it happened that you all were able to get 22 different foundations to say yes. Because getting philanthropic collaborations together is not easy. So what worked to get the 22 to come together? And when foundations say no to you, we don't want to be part of it, why are they saying no?
So it's a hard question for me to answer because all of that deal making took place last year during Global Methane Hub when we weren't even birthed yet. It happened again, philanthropies, talking to philanthropies. Marissa DeBalois, the executive director of High Tide, was instrumental in talking to, part of this, I guess we should start by saying, it's about trust. When somebody like Hannah calls you and says, I am putting together $500 million for just energy transition, you listen because she's been doing the work and she's been fighting the fight. So it's about people who you've worked with, and if she says, come and join me in this effort, there's already, step or two that the hurdles that a total random person might have to go through. So I think that was thing one. There was, honestly, from all the stories I've been told about how the $300 million came together, a lot of late night calls by the philanthropist behind High Tide, Richard Lawrence, calling up Mike Bloomberg saying, there's no way you're going to be getting off the hook. I know where you live. I know where your children go to school. So there was just a lot of that cajoling to say, this is important. I know you haven't thought about methane, but come join us. Some folks really believed in the cause and came in a big way. Some people said, let's see how they do. And once we see movement and we see there actually being momentum, then yeah, then we'll be ready to write big checks. So that's the story that I heard, and which kind of makes sense. I think, you know, philanthropists like anyone else, well, philanthropists are all mostly businessmen of a certain age, of certain education and background, and certain things appeal to them. There is a reason why, and I come from the philanthropic world in universities where you name buildings after them, right? You name large edifices, monuments, because there is something about creating legacy. Even in this climate space, if you can give them something to put their money in, where they can visualize it and it's concrete idea, I think it's easier to sell them on. And I think the idea of a fund that helps the pledge that was set up, it was actually a concrete, I mean, Sequoia probably could answer this question better than I can, because you were in the room being convinced, right, that this needed to happen.
Well, actually, if I may, there are two members of Global Methane Hub that are here. So yeah, what was compelling about this? I know in some cases it was aligned with your mission, but still you get asked to be parts of different philanthropic initiatives all the time. So what's a good one? What makes you believe that this one's going to work and makes you take the risk on the front end?
Is this on?
Yeah.
Great. I mean, first and foremost, I think it's clear to a lot of folks in the climate space the critical importance of tackling methane and short-lived climate pollutants. I heard a great descriptor from someone the other day. It's, you know, the emergency brake, it's the sprint while we're running the marathon. Like, it's how do we protect 1.5, you know, whilst proceeding really ambitiously with the broader decarbonization agenda. And, you know, I will say very candidly, and it was a consideration for us. And one of the things, you know, a priority for us is ensuring that the really ambitious methane work happens in parallel with the decarbonization agenda. And that's a meaningful challenge. You know, we've seen a lot of exploitation of, you know, intensity emission conversations in the past where you have sectors that will, you know, say they're cleaning up their methane in exchange for social license to expand their production, which, you know, does the exact opposite of accelerating the decarbonization agenda. And so one thing that's important for us in the energy-related methane work is, you know, how do we ensure that this work is, you know, a co-benefit and is accelerating the broader decarbonization work and isn't inadvertently slowing it down. And so those are conversations that we had as philanthropy and that we've worked closely with to make sure we've got those guardrails right to be as ambitious as possible across the board. And we had, you know, so I think we had good early conversations about what is the maximum impact, what are some of the key considerations we need to have for this, what does the field look like, how do we support it most effectively, and drawing on, you know, people like Fanta who have been working on the methane space. You know, we're so lucky to have experts in philanthropy and on the ground. So we'd love to turn it over to you.
Thank you for that question. So clarification, we're a line funder. We're not yet pooled funder, but we have a strategy in general to pair pooling with our own aligned funding. So that's an approach that we've taken for a lot of the issues that we work in. And, you know, for us, an institution like the Global Methane Hub is something that we envisioned from the beginning being necessary for the space to reach the scale that it needs to be. And just as a catalyst, because really the action, the implementation that needs to happen is manyfold what the resources that we've talked about, which are impressive numbers, but they're just the tip of the iceberg of what's needed for this transition. In thinking about where pooled makes sense, I think we usually look at sort of the maturity of the campaigns and the solutions, and that possibility of being able to have the kinds of sophisticated strategies being held in a pooled fund that can scale up action in geographies and in sectors in ways that individual grant makers cannot achieve. And so the rationale for a pool fund is really that, being able to take, you know, work that has reached a certain level of maturity and be able to scale it, to give it a platform, to be able to engage funders that are not going to be able to do the homework on each and every implementation approach, but can be convinced of the importance of that approach and can contribute to that scaling without necessarily having to build a program of their own. Yeah. And I think that in addition to pooling funding, having aligned funding is really important, because it's through that funding that you can go a level deeper in the field and have relationships with organizations that, and with approaches and strategies that may not be part of the main focus of the pool fund, but could be emerging, more risky, more the next, you know, generation of scalable ideas. And so I think being able to have both happening within a field is really important.
So, Colette, I want to come to you because I want to get how you're feeling when you hear about these great collaboratives, which really are important, but happen because someone calls Mike Bloomberg, which seems to be the way philanthropy has typically happened. And I really don't mean that as an insult at all. It is the way philanthropy has happened. But is that going to ensure that we get the kind of forward-thinking climate justice work that you're hoping to accomplish?
Well, I have opinions. I mean, it's been a really interesting position to be part of a frontline community and then to move into a space of leadership in a community, right? Having a lot of trust, taking a lot of time to build a lot of trust on the ground, and then having to sit in rooms with allied funders who mean well, who want to help, who want to know, but then bring in, I think, a very accurate understanding of who we're talking about, where the money sits. The truth is the money sits with people who don't value my community. They don't value our solutions. They don't value our lives. And so to believe that they would fund the steps that we need to take to dismantle the system that got us here in the first place is a very interesting tension to hold. Are we really going to get the help we need to get us out of the position that we were put in? Not that we got ourselves into, but that we were put in. I think it's been challenging watching dollars come to the region. We have come up with very interesting ways of calling funders to the table. There are some folks that we have not yet had a political conversation with who want to say they funded the Gulf. And we say, we don't want your money as an organization of Taproot, but we'll get that to the ground for you. Our role is to make sure that we can hold a political line if we ever get in negotiations about how systems need to change, while also taking dollars and get them to the ground because they're needed and they're necessary. This is a very complicated process, but we've established independent standing community control funds. So we have a community control fund that spans 5 states and Puerto Rico: Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, and Puerto Rico. And we get the money there and we say, y'all make a collective decision about this. We won't take any of those dollars, but you get it to the ground the way you need to do that. Now there are conversations. Should we take this money? That's a real conversation on the ground. The money that we are taking is actually pulled from a lot of our communities in a very violent and oppressive way. Should we take this money? And once there's a collective decision to do so, there's a collective decision on how we're going to take it. If we take it, here's what we're going to do. We are not going to give you 15 different grant reports. We will give you one regional report of what we do with those dollars. It's important for you to know what happens, but it's also important for us to not feel like we're having to once again submit to the powers that put us here. How do we build power in this process? It's a tough reality. And I'm not sure that some of the folks mentioned here, the Bloombergs, the Bezoses, you know, they're not listening for our solutions. We need champions. We actually have to make friends in the philanthropic world who take the time to hear not just the concrete things that we can deliver, like a building or an edifice, but there's real healing that has to happen. There's real invisible work that has to happen. It's usually gender-based work that is invisibilized, that is often not invested in. So this is what we push. We do it with champions. I'm not sure that this is giving us exactly what we need, but what we are getting more and more, and as you were saying with some of the statistics of seeing this growth, is a seat at the table to be really honest about what the conditions are and what it's going to take for us to get out of it. In a place like Louisiana, if you don't have a grassroots movement, you cannot take on oil and gas in the U.S. So the best thing you could do is invest in the movement that's happening in the ground, especially if we want to curb methane and other pollutants.
So I'm going to go to Patty with a question and to respond directly to that. I also give you your warning that if you have questions, get them ready because we're going to come to the audience soon. So Patty, I want you to respond, but in more broadly and see if there are other responses too. Like, okay, hey, I also do philanthropy as part of my life, and I would say, I'm not sure it's fair to hear you say we don't care about your community. I think philanthropists would say they think they do at least. And so maybe I'll try to ask this in the way, you know, Patty, how do you guys think about the communities that you're impacting? And how do you respond to the critique that says, you guys don't really get us?
So this is going to lead nicely into asking all of you to join in and participate in the conversation. I personally always have a difficult time in a conversation where everyone's agreeing and saying the same thing. If I walk out of a meeting or a convening and we all seem to be in lockstep, there's always an alarm that goes off in my head. How could we all, coming from such different, if we had the right group in the room, you know, from such different experiences and backgrounds, all come out like, okay, this was a good meeting. Yeah, no. So for me, the rich meetings are the ones where there is that little bit of, I don't think I saw that. You know, I don't see it from that point of view. I just came a couple of weeks ago from a great convening of UNEP. You know, we're starting to start up this methane emissions observatory and it's called MARS program, which is a methane alert system. And every day, every conversation was a fight. But we ended every day all sitting around the dinner tables, sharing, you know, but to me, that kind of conversation needs to happen more often, and especially with our grantees in the field and our ecosystem. I always feel a little uncomfortable when I'm having conversations with our grantees that seem so agreeable, because there's just no way we are meeting all your expectations and needs. So we want you to be direct. I want to hear that you guys are too slow in getting your grants out. Are you really thinking about, okay, see, like the entire front row's laughing, but not one person has actually said those words to us directly. So no, but those are the conversations we need to have if we're going to be better at what we're doing.
Fanta?
I just wanted to add to that. I mean, the way I would translate that is that, you know, we have privilege, right, to be in these positions, and that gives us, not to be cliche, some responsibilities. And the responsibility is to share power. It's to diminish that distance between the folks that we are supporting and build true partnerships, you know, that are based on trust, in reciprocity, and standing in people's shoes and understanding their viewpoint, maybe not always agreeing, maybe not always having the same priorities, but at least having those conversations so that we can learn together. I think that's really important. And not having a conversation about power when we talk about philanthropy is, not really having a conversation about the relationship we're in.
Perfect. Okay, thank you for that. Or do you want to briefly
This is such a critical conversation to me, because I think the power dynamic between philanthropists and grantees is very real. It's absolutely real, and I also think it's a real challenge to shrink it. Don't bite the hand that feeds you. And so how do we create the circumstances where you can have those conversations? It's one thing for me to tell a grantee, hey, I want you to be super honest with me. We try, but that only gets you so far. You have to have high trust relationships to actually make that meaningful. Someone... Is this dying? Okay. When I was considering coming into philanthropy, someone said, you're about to get 5 times funnier, 10 times smarter, and 100 times prettier. Because people, your ideas are suddenly good. And it's important for us in consideration conversations, because if I'm having a strategic conversation and I forget I'm wearing my philanthropic hat, anything I say is going to be taken as a signal of, oh, that person is interested in this. How do we shape our work around that particular interest? That's not how this should happen. This should be about what are the best strategies coming, from the bottom up in terms of what needs to happen in the field, and, how do we support that? And yes, we have philanthropic strategies, but they're philanthropic strategies. They shouldn't be, field or issue strategies. And so that's a marriage. We have to figure it out, and we have to figure out meaningful ways to shrink that, or at least acknowledge in a way that allows us to have the constructive conversation we need to do our collective best work around that power.
Okay, let me go to the audience and see if we can do 2 or 3 questions at once, because we're getting short of time. One of these. Are there questions? In the back row, Sabrina. And then we'll go to Amy next.
So I just want to say thank you all for this really important conversation. And so I would just have a question for... Oh, here? Okay. For the funders, as I was just on at a workshop where a funder who I would consider a heavy hitter in this space said the science is the most important. And so I just want to know how you would respond to that, especially given my experience in what I do is with frontline communities, frontline partners in the energy equity space. It is next to impossible for me to get funding for my work stream, but I see my other colleagues and the money pours in for their work streams, which are heavily science-based.
Great, thanks. Amy?
I think, yes, we're going to get 3 questions and then answers.
Yep.
This is, might be too complicated, but when you launch the Methane Hub, my understanding is, so it's a question of, I want to ask how philanthropy thinks about what the science is saying and how feasible the solutions are, because we're trying to make that impact quickly. And so in the case of the Methane Hub, the detection is starting with oil and gas. And yet when you combine rice and livestock, it's over half of methane emissions. And so I guess A, how quickly you're going to bring those on, and B, I just don't see philanthropy acting around livestock, because I think it's a complicated issue, and rice potentially as well, but there are some really great solutions for rice as well. So I'm just wondering how you, here's what the data is saying, but where are the solutions? So how do you make those calls? Might be too complicated for this quick time, but thanks.
All right, and right here.
Hi, my name's Fanny Calder. I'm the Executive Director of Funder Forum on Oil and Gas, which helps to organize philanthropy in a similar way, though not as a re-grantor to the Methane Hub. Couple of things. One of the things, just wanted to build on this story about power. I think that there's another kind of giving power that philanthropy can give. We have an extraordinary privilege in that we have this extraordinary overview of the entire ecosystem that is trying to fight climate change, because we built most of it, and we have deep relationships with a lot of it. And I think for me, one of the most empowering things I've been able to do with grantees and partners is share that map with them and help them to see how their work can be a part of that bigger whole. So it's organizing, but at an insane global level. That's kind of what we do. And I think that's something we need to be really aware of. And I also think we need to be get better as philanthropists at understanding how we win to the frontline point. It's like we win on fossil fuels always because of frontline communities. And when I used to be in CIF, it was never acknowledged. We were funding that work, but it was never called out. The evidence base was never made clear. So I think there's a lot of work. Philanthropy is funded by evidence. It's fueled by evidence. It's another way of talking about science. So the more you have the evidence base of how many infrastructure battles we've won and what a critical part the front line played in that, I'm afraid it's a very a kind of an extractive view of supporting your group, so you may not want to play into it, but if you want to raise more money, it is effective. So those were really the points I wanted to. Oh, and finally, on agriculture, the other thing that we can do as philanthropy is look at the playbooks that have worked and try and replicate them. So in my last job, I was taking work on coal and oil and gas and working out how to replicate that for meat. And that work is starting to go, but we are way behind. Totally agree.
Awesome. Okay, so let's do the science question first. So, the assertion is it's the science that matters most. I would love, Fanta, to get your perspective and also yours, Colette.
I'm sure everybody has an opinion on that. I have a couple of things to say. Why is science not also social science? Like, there's a lot of evidence from social science of what actually changes policies and practices and even societies. And so I think one thing that we can do a better job, especially foundations that are looking at their strategies, not only in the concept of science, but also social science, is to talk a little bit more about that and what we're seeing as evidence, what research we're using to underlie our strategies, which are not only those of climate science, but also of social science. So I just wanted to add that to this conversation.
Yeah, well, I don't know if we know it or not, but this conversation actually is this is the breaking point conversation. So let me just say about science. We have not yet acknowledged that the oldest existing science is traditional ecological knowledge, because science is actually observation. But if we want to talk about science, we're usually talking about white, Western, European-based science, which is another way of privileging and continuing a colonizing perspective. If we want to be honest about this, the longest, most evidence-based science is in the indigenous communities. And if you want to fund evidence-based anything, fund that. That's the first thing. I'm not sure we're ready to go there. Maybe we'll pretend like that's not true, but it is true. The second thing is, we're really going around a big thing here. How do we continue to fund the things in the system that exists? The problem is the system. You're trying to use tactics and methods inside of a system that has created this imbalance. This is not about people making poor individual choices and finding themselves on the front line. This is about a system that has created this world. And if we're actually going to change this world through philanthropy, you've got to change the system. That means how you fund has to be different. Now, you might not want to face this. This might not be the right time in your organization, but that's what we're talking about. And the tension between the ground and philanthropy is people who want to work inside of a system that is working perfectly well for you, whether it's your job and or your individual wealth, and people who need you to understand that the system as it currently exists has oppressed us to a point of imbalancing the planet, not just my community. Now, if we want to face this, what we must do is ally, because we have to have hard conversations where we're not all going to agree. But what we cannot do is pretend that we can use the same tactics over and over again and get a different result. Someone told me that was insanity, and that is what we are perpetuating. So let us go into our new sanity. There is an opportunity for us to do this different, but we're going to have to face some hard truths, which takes a little bit of courage of most of you inside of your organizations to say, we've got to look at this a different way, a very different way, and we've got to challenge the system.
And with apologies to the rest of the panel, I've gotten the note that we are done because they need the room. But what an extraordinary way to end. Thank you for that challenge. And thanks all of you. I hope you'll join me in thanking the panel for really wonderful discussion.